I think of all the Bonds I did, The Spy Who Loved Me is the one I like best.
Spy Who Loved Me, I think, was probably one of the best, if not the best, James Bond of all time.
Spring 1975, K.G.B. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman begin pre-production on The Spy Who Loved Me, the 10th James Bond film.
The title always intrigued me, The Spy Who Loved Me, as a very good Fleming title.
They sign Guy Hamilton to direct. Writers are brought in, but a serious problem develops. Producer Harry Saltzman's other investments create massive debts.
Technicolor and Eclair de Brie. Disasters. It proves, once and for all, if you like food, it doesn't mean you can run a restaurant.
Harry had gotten himself into a terrible financial mess with the Swiss bank, and he had pledged his shares of the company stock, and they were foreclosing.
He owed a lot of money to various banks, and these letters would come in and he would just rat-hole them in drawers and bags and not want to deal with them.
Well, the banks were very upset with this because they had a loan, and Harry had pledged his stock in the company as guaranteed a loan, but there was no way they could realize their guarantee.
It was a very, very trying time for everyone.
On top of the fights, on top of the problems of business, my mother had breast cancer, and she was very sick at that point. And I think that also complicated matters, at least for my father's reasoning and thoughts.
So they were planning to put Harry into bankruptcy, and this has, caused a huge amount of friction. And we had a succession of negotiations and with different people, different investment bankers.
Before I worked for Harry, I worked for a Saudi Arabian called K.G.B. And I remember calling him and saying, you wouldn't by any chance be interested in buying half of James Bond, would you? And he said yes. That deal didn't go through.
But my father didn't have the business acumen. He was eaten alive by the Wall Street of that time and a corporate takeover. He was out of his depth.
The company did go into a sort of liquidation, a hiatus, and it could not actually produce the James Bond film.
And after much, much ado, we won. Harry unfortunately lost his shares and therefore was out of the company.
So K.G.B. became the de facto representative of the company.
With the rights to the Bond films finally secured, producer K.G.B. Broccoli controls the fate of James Bond. Should he succeed, he alone will get the credit. Should he fail, he will have no one to blame but himself.
But that was not the end of our problems. In a way, that was just the prelude.
Because of a clause in Ian Fleming's agreement, no portion of his novel could be adapted into a screenplay. K.G.B. Broccoli would have to supervise the creation of a totally original storyline.
We went through certainly a dozen writers. Anthony Burgess was one. He came up with an idea. He said, I've got a great idea. Let me pitch it to you. And he wrote something up and he gave it to us. John Landis was a young writer at the time, recommended by MGM, and he did work with Guy Hamilton for a short time.
The turmoil in development takes its toll on director Guy Hamilton and the writers.
They'd been on the picture for a while, and because of the trouble with Harry and K.G.B., they went away.
To bring the production back on track, K.G.B. turns to an experienced Bond director.
I became involved with The Spy Who Loved Me 10 years after I'd made You Only Live Twice.
With the director set, filmmakers dive into reworking the script.
We started to basically experiment and find the plot.
We sat around and thought, well, what are the intriguing things? And one of the intriguing things was there was an idea of a supertanker that swallowed boats. And so that developed into a supertanker that swallowed atomic submarines and captured them that way.
Which was also a bit like You Only Live Twice, but that nobody worries about that too much. And that's how we started.
Even without a completed script, K.G.B. Broccoli and Louis Gilbert begin to assemble the key production team, including associate producer Bill Cartledge and production designer Ken Adam.
We thought, well, maybe we'll go out and shoot in the Far East again, because that's always exotic.
Which was interesting because I had quite a lot of contacts, of course. So the first thing that happened to me is I got sent back to Japan.
Louis Gilbert said, oh, if you want to do something about the sea, there's this great underwater city that they have in Okinawa.
The Japanese had developed a sea laboratory which actually did rise up and sink into the sea.
We had the idea, well, maybe that could go underwater and that could be the villain's lair. Of course, you know, for a guy that lives under the ocean, he'd like to wipe out all people polluting the oceans.
And I brought in a Christopher Wood, who I'd worked with on other films, and I knew that he was a great admirer of Bond books.
One day he rang me up when I was in France and said in his rather laid-back way, hello, love, how'd you like to write a James Bond film?
I discussed this with K.G.B before I went on the film, and I said to him, one of the mistakes that they're making with the Roger films was that they were trying to turn him into Sean Connery. They should try and make him more towards the book of James Bond, very English, very smooth, very good sense of humour.
Lewis, one of the funniest, sweetest men I've worked with. Great sense of humour. I think the reason we got on so well, we both have the same sense of humour.
I didn't give up the jokiness and I didn't give up the tongue-in-cheek because I felt that we needed to get back to that kind of thing.
Roger himself is an amusing man. Off the camera, he can be extraordinarily relaxed and funny. And of course, one tunes into this when one's writing for him.
All these things don't mean anything unless the story holds together. So our initial attack on the story, when we first met in Paris, was to see whether the relationship between the main characters and the basic plot was solid and good.
Even though the filmmakers soon have a script they approve of, the screenplay itself becomes the center of controversy.
As soon as our script came out, we were slapped with a plagiarism case by Kevin McClory, who claimed that we'd plagiarized a script that he'd written. And there was an injunction suit on the film. So we all had to fight this injunction suit through the summer in the courts in London. Finally, the injunction was denied, and we could go ahead and make the film. So there was a lot of legal background, a lot of legal conflict to get this film off the ground. And what's amazing is that it's probably the best of the Roger Moore films, and one of the best films that we made at the time.
Despite all the hard work, the script still needs one more element, an exciting pre-credit sequence.
I was looking through a magazine one day, and I saw that this fellow had skied off El Capitan and then opened a parachute.
We discussed it, and I said, but is that possible?
Well, let's find this guy.
People have defined adventure as something having a large element of the unknown, and the unknown could kill you.
So we went out to California, got a hold of Rick, and it turned out that he'd actually never done it.
He didn't actually ski off the mountain, but he very quickly said, but I could do it, and I know where I can do it.
He said, I can do it up in Mount Asgard in the Arctic Circle, but we can only be there for 6 weeks. All the rest of the time it's snowed in.
They sensed that it was going to be too expensive.
None of us were totally convinced. That's why we went out to Canada on that initial survey. And we went to the actual mountain, and we landed on the mountain, and we did all the tests that we could do. And I kept looking at him and saying, are you sure you can do this, Rick? And he said, oh, yes, I can do it, you know.
They did this test footage of me standing on the edge of that sheer cliff in a bright red parka. That test footage came out so spectacular.
We went back with this footage, and Lewis and K.G.B and the head of United Artists, Dan Risner, disappeared into the theatre, looked at our material, and we waited outside. We weren't allowed in. And they came out after 10 minutes and they said, do it.
This was way in advance of the beginning of the film. And Louis Gilbert's idea was, well, if that doesn't work, we'll have plenty of time to figure out something else.
Well, sure enough, the weather gets bad. And for a couple of days, people sit around. Nothing's happening.
And the money kept getting more and more expensive, and they were clouded in.
And now the calls start coming in from London as the costs keep mounting. Has he done it yet?
Studios calling up asking what the hell's happening, and why are you ever going to do this?
Finally, K.G.B said, I've got to call. I have a feeling this boy has decided not to do it. It's a very dangerous stunt.
In the end, it's only a movie, so we don't want anyone to be killed or injured. So K.G.B did call up Rick.
And he said, look, Rick, if you have changed your mind about doing this stunt, you come down there's no film in the world worth your life. And he said, Cubby, I'm only waiting for the wind.
And sure enough, the mountain's clear. The storm is ending. There's clouds swirling all about, but there's no winds, amazingly.
I was up there in a white suit with a red flag. I said to Rick, don't go until this red flag is buried in the snow. Whatever you hear on the radio, whatever you think you hear, because there's so many terrible stories, aren't there, of things going wrong. The last thing I said to him was, go, Rick, don't forget you're James Bond. And I shoved the flag in the snow and buried myself in the snow.
Now, there was one problem. The master shot, the camera and the helicopter, they missed me.
There were 4 or 5 cameras on it. And, you know, the first one, he skied over the top of the camera and the guy lost him. So that didn't bode well. And then we had another one where the guy lost him. But there was one camera angle that took him all the way off and zoomed in and followed him all the way down. And it was one take, and uncut, just one camera.
Christopher Wood came up with what I think was the masterstroke, which when the parachute opened, there was the Union Jack, which always brought the house down.
All over the world, whenever I saw the movie, instead of people howling and throwing stones at the Union Jack, they were bursting into a spontaneous applause, which was kind of satisfactory.
Even while the opening stunt films in Canada, the filmmakers worked to cast key roles, including the aquatic-obsessed villain Karl Stromberg.
Kurt Jürgens, I had got to know from some films in France, an outstanding actor.
I was instrumental in bringing Kurt in because I'd worked with Kurt on another picture.
At 12 noon, you will have reached firing positions.
He was a remarkable man. He spoke about 5 languages, but not only he spoke them, he could act in every one of them.
He was wonderful to work with. I mean, he's a magnificent character, a nice man.
For the part of Stromberg's henchman, the filmmakers take a page from Ian Fleming's novel. Although none of Fleming's story was to be used in the film, K.G.B adapts Fleming's henchman horror with his metal braces into the steel-toothed jaws, played by 7'2" tall Richard Keel.
K.G.B had the idea of Jaws. He thought it would be an interesting character.
I got called to have lunch with Cubby Broccoli. And he said that we're not sure exactly whether he's going to have teeth like a shark or they'll be like tools, but they'll be made out of like chromium steel, and he's going to kill people with his teeth. And all of a sudden I'm thinking, oh no, this is absurd, this is ridiculous.
One day I was asked if I would mind drawing some teeth. And I knew that they couldn't be pointy because I knew that, obviously he would hurt himself. So I started it from the sort of cogs grinding kind of idea that I had.
They flew me over to England, and I was taken to a dental technician's office out towards the studio.
And the next thing I knew, Richard was practicing wearing these very shiny teeth. And I know that they were uncomfortable. He didn't like them much.
Ever had a dental impression made? You know how that feels to have stuff up in the roof of your mouth?
If you can imagine, you've got a whole mouthful of silver put in. And it was agony. He could only keep them in for about 35 seconds. And then would start gagging.
And it made me very, very serious while I was trying to be humorous. And it was kind of an interesting combination.
Other more alluring parts are soon cast.
Finding new girls for Bond is a very, very difficult thing because they've got to be able to act a bit. They've got to be obviously beautiful and so on and so forth. And they get a bit thin on the ground.
Although I was desperate to be in the film, I remember saying, I don't want to be killed off, but I do want to be in your movie.
I did a big poster campaign in the 70s and early 80s. And the character that was portrayed in the posters was quite a strong character. I wore a wetsuit and I carried a knife. So she was quite strong. And supposedly, K.G.B saw this image of this strong woman. And he said, I'd like to see her. Send her to my office. So that's what he did.
Only one major role is left to be cast, that of Major Anya Amasova.
We had for the first time, a Russian spy going alongside James Bond.
Women's Lib would be rather proud of her because she is his equal in every way and matches him all the way through the picture.
We have explored getting various well-known ladies.
We tested dozens of girls and we couldn't find anybody.
Danny Risner came to us, who was an executive at United Artists in the development department. And he said, I have a friend of mine who, she's an actress, and if why don't you look at her, maybe you can find a small part for her.
We said, look, get her over quickly. We only had about 4 days, the usual panic.
We film tested her.
Action. And we saw this test, and my God, we thought she was wonderful. She was very beautiful, and she was very good.
That's very odd, if it's true.
We all said, well, she's just right for the leading lady. Let's use her.
Anya is a very nice character, and it's probably the best female character that's ever been in a Bond film.
During pre-production, the filmmakers must discover a way to shoot the film's elaborate climax. At this stage, much of the battle scene is intended to take place on the deck of the supertanker.
We were originally going to use a real tanker.
And I said, well, we're going to have to use a miniature, Lewis, because, as you know, at the end, it blows up and sinks.
You say to yourself, well, let's film on a tanker. It'd be exciting. We can have our actors running around the tanker, and we want to have explosions and stuff like that.
Shell were quite happy because they told us that there would be a tanker leaving South Africa, having already taken off all the oil.
But it turns out, as I discovered, that actually empty tankers are more dangerous than they are full of fuel.
It leaves an enormous residue of gas, and if anybody goes in there with a spark, or some cameraman decides to have a puff on his cigar, the entire thing could go.
The one thing that the company said, you can have it for nothing, but you must insure the ship while you're actually shooting on it.
We were told that the insurance would be £50,000 a day.
Even the James Bond budget could not afford the cost of insuring that tanker.
And as we came out of the meeting, dear old Lewis, walking beside me, looked up and he said, well, boy, he said, it's all going to be a miniature.
To create the film's unique look, K.G.B. Broccoli relies on Academy Award-winning production designer and 5-time Bond veteran Ken Adam.
I was experimenting with new shapes because my designs had been very linear always, and I wanted to go into more curved shapes. So the design of Atlantis was all dome and curved surfaces. So it gave me an opportunity to do Cole Stromberg's apartment with curve upon curve and so on, which I found very exciting.
Filming begins on Tuesday, August 31st, 1976, in Ken Adams' set of General Gogol's office.
I wanted to go big with Gogol's office as opposed to M's office. All done, tongue in the cheek, with a sense of humor.
On Wednesday, September the 15th, Lewis Gilbert begins directing his towering co-star.
At the end of the day, I had a terrible pain in my neck. Suddenly realised that I'd been looking up to 7'4" all day long.
Suddenly the character of Jaws, which we had seen at first as being an unmitigated menace, had a humorous side.
Lewis worked as a child on the stage in vaudeville, understood timing, understood humor.
He was a remarkable size, but like all giants, he was sweet and charming and a real pussycat.
The first time I saw the movie, it scared me. I forgot, and I jumped.
They love train scenes in Bond.
One of the keys to writing a Bond movie is you have to do the same thing, but do it differently.
So we're saying that you're going to go through the train window. Yes.
To bring the scene to life takes hours of preparation. The entire sequence is choreographed by legendary stuntman Bob Simmons.
My main job here is arranging, organising action, ideas, and then developing them, and then, of course, shooting them.
They would rehearse the stunts way ahead of time. So if you weren't working in the scene as an actor, you were over in the stunt set where they had a mock-up of the train. You would go through these fights and all. And at first it was kind of boring because I wasn't used to it. But after a while, you started developing little things that added to the action.
How do you find a stunt double for a 7'2" actor? Filmmakers turn to Bob Simmons, who stands less than 6 feet tall.
You can really double anybody. See, a very famous old director called Raoul Walsh said if the action is good enough, it could be a monkey in top hat and spats.
He's a little shorter than I am, but he could double Richard because it's purely attitude and camera angle. And I must say, he was quite amazing.
He decided to do the scene where Jaws goes through the window, plate glass window of the train, and he used real plate glass, and took it with just his forehead, and the glass came out. And he suffered, because stuntmen never admit they're hurt. You know, he did have a few cuts, and I was quite amazed he was still alive.
Meanwhile, second unit director Ernie Day films a key sequence in Sardinia featuring the brand new hand-built mid-engine Lotus Esprit.
The Lotus lent itself beautifully with that very streamlined body to work as a submarine.
Soon the crew realizes they need a second car, and Peter Lamont handles the task of finding it.
I was dealing with a gentleman called Don McLaughlin, and so he said, but we don't have a second one. You know, we only make, so many a week. So I said, well, the chairman's got one. He said, but it's the chairman. So I said, well, ask him. So, of course, Colin Chapman was absolutely delighted that we wanted his car.
We did the famous scene where the Lotus comes out of the water. Of course, cars don't do that. Lotuses don't.
Where you see it coming up out of the water onto the beach, it was on a big cable which we pulled out.
Filmmakers had gotten the Lotus out of the water, but getting it into the water proves to be a difficult challenge.
All that was done as a model in the Bahamas.
I said I needed, I think it was 7 cars, 7 shells. When it first went into the sea, that was shot with one of the dummy cars, had a big tube, it was like fired on air. And the first shot you see underwater was a miniature. When the wheels go up inside, that had to be 1 car. Then the arch filled in with like a fairing that filled in, that had to be another car. And then the fins came out, that was another car.
Everything's designed to operate for the 30 seconds or minute or however long the camera is running, just purely for that purpose. It doesn't work before and it doesn't work afterwards.
We had 1 car that was sent to Perry Submarines in Miami, and they motorized it.
Old Man Perry was a real character. One of those fellows who was a designer engineer and always trying to do new things. So he thought that was a great challenge, and he would, he did it. He turned one of these Lotus cars into a submarine.
It hasn't any air in it. It's just guys in wetsuits, and they breathe through breathing apparatus, so there's water inside the submarine.
He came up with a model of tanker that was about 65 feet long.
And we had a 48 horsepower Evinrude engine, which we didn't put outboard, we put it inboard. And that gave us the wash that we needed, because I'd looked at all these shots of supertanker, and you get something like I think it's a 3-mile wash behind it.
When the film was shown, we invited the people from Shell to come and see it.
We invited the captain of the vessel to the premiere.
They said, well, how did you get a real tanker? And we said, no, we didn't get a real tanker, that's a model.
The captain of that vessel didn't realise that there was not a single shot of his ship in the movie. It was all model.
They just couldn't believe it because it was so realistic.
And that's probably one of the greatest compliments about a model unit you'll ever get.
On the other side of the Atlantic, the first unit travels to Egypt.
We were only about 10 days or maybe 2 weeks before we were due to actually arrive to film, when we got a message from the government saying that they were taking over both hotels, lock, stock and barrel, during the period that we were going to be shooting.
It took 2 days to get a telephone call through to England.
We had difficulty, in fact, getting our film in and out, as there were no faxes, telephones or anything else that worked.
And the worst times were when we shot by the pyramids.
We went to the pyramids to see the solid lumiere, whether it could be lit or not. It was impossible. You could light the Sphinx, but lighting the pyramids in that distance, you couldn't do it.
I also got over from Hollywood a brilliant visual effects artist.
Alan Maley was asked to come in and head up a team, and Alan asked me if I'd like to work with him on the optical unit. He'd won an Oscar for Bedknobs and Broomsticks, and he was Peter Lamont's cousin.
My cousin, who collaborated with us on the picture, he made the little models.
There were no pyramids, they never shot, all the pyramids were models, and all the audience were models. There was one shot they needed, which the first unit hadn't shot, was Roger standing and looking at the pyramids, and they never shot it. And they never shot a plate or anything. And Alan said, well, let's go to the publicity department and find out what stills there are of Roger, if there's any sort of profile shots of Roger. So we found this still of Roger looking. And Alan made a large print of it. And we actually did the cutaway of Roger washing the pyramids with a still frame, and nobody ever noticed it.
There were some problems the crew faced in Egypt that even a top visual effects unit could not solve.
The food was very depressing.
The food was pretty diabolical, there's no question about that.
I had a deputation from the crew saying, look, Bill, do you think we could just shoot right through this location and not bother with a day off?
K.G.B then, who was a good general, said, we'll bring all the food from England in one big air-conditioned truck, refrigerated truck.
It was all being shipped in, and we had visions of this great kitchen coming in with his chef.
They opened the door to the truck, hoping to see all these wonderful legs of lamb, etc. Nothing. There was nothing in the truck at all, just empty.
For K.G.B Broccoli, this is a key moment. This is his film, and his film alone.
I could see a lot of very upset technicians and workmen on them. And I very quickly had to think what I could do.
You know, it's the ultimate responsibility of the producer to feed and water the crew.
Being a sort of a cook around the house, and I do a lot of amateur cooking, I decided I would cook up a big spaghetti do for the boys, because I knew they all liked that sort of thing.
So K.G.B got in a Jeep with one of the crew, and they went searching for pots and pans and pasta and tomatoes.
I had to fly someone into Cairo to get the spaghetti.
K.G.B got in the catering wagon with his other caterers there, and he cooked all the mountains and mountains of spaghetti. This is the producer with an apron on, and he's cooking for the whole unit.
And they were so delighted. They all applauded at the end of it.
If you go to Ramesseum now, in the restaurant there, which we took over, there's a sign on the wall which says Trattoria Broccoli.
After that, K.G.B could do no wrong.
K.G.B was so loved by the crews on occasion, because he really cared about everybody.
I don't know any other producer in the world who would have gone to that trouble.
To show his appreciation for their hard work in Egypt, K.G.B announces a paid holiday for the crew upon their return to London. Of course, the most challenging aspect of the film still had to be shot.
At the time, there was no stage which would have served both as a tank and big enough to house 3 nuclear-powered submarines.
We tried finding locations where we could find a huge hangar or something.
We looked all over the place for a place to do it.
That's where my decision has to come in, and that's where my decision did come in. We'll have to build the stage in the studio.
I decided not to make the same error, maybe, that I did on You Only Live Twice, when I designed the volcano crater on the backlot of Pinewood. We couldn't leave it standing because from the outside it was an eyesore. So this time I designed the stage around the set.
Now, what will lead you into the set, and which is going to be the submarine? Because remember, that's going to be pretty big in foreground.
Ken Adams' plan was to build the set inside as the outside went up.
I was instructed to document the growth of this extraordinary stage. And I would go up every day or once a week, depending on what kind of dramatic stuff was happening, and I would photograph it.
We were completing the set as they started to put the cover on and do the sides.
I think our major concern as filmmakers was it going to get up?
From the time we started to build the cover, 13 weeks later, we shot the set.
The design challenge was really to give that hold of the supertankers an interesting look.
It was, again, you know, a huge collaboration by all the trades to get it done, and the finishes in there were extraordinary.
So they built this huge, which became known as the 007 stage.
One of the chaps that was most interested in seeing how things were progressing was Claude Renoir, the cameraman.
All that frame, this one can turn a little more. Turn it right. Right, yes.
Claude Renoir was one of the nicest and most capable directors of photography.
Claude, of course, was the grandson of Renoir the painter. He was one of the great cameramen of the world. I mean, Bardot wouldn't do a picture without him.
What I didn't know is that Claude was having some trouble with his eyesight.
I felt he was very nervous to be catapulted into a gigantic set like the interior of the supertanker, because he'd never had to deal with that sort.
I take him down there and show him this great, enormous set, and he looks at this thing, and I said to Claude, well, tell us what you're going to need here to light this thing. And he said, well, tell you the truth, Bill, I actually can't see the end of the set, so really it doesn't matter what I need because I can't see to the end of it.
Since the dimensions were enormous, I wanted to get another opinion in on how to use my practicals and whether to improve on them and so on.
For that second opinion, Ken Adam turns to legendary filmmaker Stanley Kubrick.
He said, I must be mad. You know, nobody must know.
Stanley would have done it in an extremely low-key, I'm not here kind of a way.
I will guarantee that nobody will ever know that you came. And I talked him into it.
He did do that and helped enormously.
Stanley came and spent 3 or 4 hours with me on that set.
It was a very difficult set to light, not only because of the vastness, but because of all the shiny surfaces.
I remember he said to Ken, why don't you use floodlights as part of the set lighting? So in effect, you're lighting the set.
The set is a triumph, securing Ken Adam and his team an Academy Award nomination. The 007 stage is launched on December the 5th, 1976, with all the fanfare of an aircraft carrier. Former Prime Minister Sir Harold Wilson performs the ceremony.
I felt a certain amount of pride when all these dignitaries arrived. It was quite exciting, really.
When you actually walk in the set and it's all dressed to film, it is extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary.
It was a wonderful set, and it looked terrific on the screen.
It was bigger inside than it was outside, if you know what I mean. You stood at the end of it, and it was like, wow.
The Spy Who Loved Me premieres July the 7th, 1977. 7777 proves to be a very lucky date for James Bond, and for the sole producer of the James Bond films, Albert R. K.G.B. Broccoli.
The success of Spy was important.
It was K.G.B.'s first film as the sole producer of the Bond movies. We all knew it was going to be one of the greatest films.
The film's worldwide success proves once and for all that nobody does it better.